Okay, fourth and last part. The last part is slightly more complex simply because we're going to do a couple of things at the same time. Okay, so there's three different concepts that we're going to learn. The main one here is that we want to read from a file. That's what we're going to do. We want to read from a file. Okay, but when are we reading from a file? We want to read from a file every time that we open this screen. So we need to learn how to do something when a screen opens, right? So far, we know how to do something when a button is pressed, right? But we haven't done something when a screen is open. So we're gonna learn how to do something when a screen is open. That's one thing. We're gonna then read from the file, yeah? And then we're gonna need to convert that file into the array list and the array list into the file. And the last thing that we're gonna do, we're gonna leave that at the last because it might be a little bit confusing, which is to actually display it as a table with this table view, okay? So initially, I'm not gonna use the table view, just not to confuse you. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is actually use the table view, okay? So let's start with first things first. How do I manage, so my application does something when I start the application, okay? So in order to do that, I'm gonna go into my controller, okay? And what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna change the entire controller, okay? So I'm gonna tell my controller that now is going to be a type of controller that is going to allow itself to be initialized, okay? So we're gonna create a method that is called initialize, but in order to create that method, we need to make sure that our class actually implements. We're gonna learn more of that in OOP 5, but for now, just follow my lead. Implement something that is called initializable, okay? So it's gonna tell me an error because if I wanna do that, then I need to implement a specific method that it's called the method initialize. I'm gonna let IntelliJ do that automatically for me, and it's going to create this method for me. It's at the bottom. I'm just gonna leave it there at the bottom, that's okay. So it's gonna create this method for me, initialize, that has a URL, that's where am I located, and it has what resources am I using, okay? Perfect. So this method is going to run as soon as the screen finished loading, either of the two screens. So at this moment, because I have two different screens running with the same controller, this method is gonna happen when either of those two finish loading, okay? What do I want to happen when this finish loading? I want to read from the file. That's what I want to do. But again, of course, I'm not going to do that here because that's logic. That's not GUI. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go and do that on my personal finance list file. So remember that I do have a personal finance list object already here that I made a static, so it works in both screens, right? It's called PFL. So I'm going to use that one. I'm going to say PFL, and I'm going to create a method. We have the method add entry. Let's create a method to read the entries. How about that? Read the entries from the file, right? So on the list, if you remember, we did this method before to add an entry. Let's create another method to read the entries. Let's call it read entries. I think I call it, right? And that one is going to read all of the entries from the text file that we created from this text file records, okay? There you go. So we're gonna go into our personal finance list and make sure to create that method read entry. So this is the part in which we're actually going to simply read from the file. How do we do that? So we're gonna use the same that I showed you guys in class. Hopefully, the way to do that is that I'm actually going to, you know what I'm gonna do? No, let's just first finish this method and then we're gonna go back there. So we're gonna need to use, like I mentioned before, we're gonna need to use now a reader. We were writing before, now we're gonna read, okay? So we're gonna use a file reader this time. Let's call it file reader or FL. And we're gonna use a constructor that requires for me to specify which file I'm going to read. So I'm gonna say a new file, and that file is gonna be the file, what do they call it? records. There you go. So that's the one that we want to read. Boom, ready. We are also going to need a buffered reader this time. Not a buffered writer, but a buffered reader. Let's call it the buffered BR, buffered reader. It's going to be using a constructor that requires a file reader. So I'm going to pass the file reader that I created. Done. Okay. So what is it? Again, this is going to try to access a file. So therefore, I need to make sure that this throws an IO exception and all good. Okay. It's going to tell me I'm calling this method from the controller. So this method also needs to make sure to throw an IO exception. All good. Okay. Now that I have, why is this throwing me an error here? Oh no, it's not gonna let me here. Wait a second. No, actually, I don't need this here because this method is overwritten. So I can't do that. Oh, since I cannot do that here, it is going to recommend me that I surround this with a try catch. I'm also going to split the try catch statement in class. But basically what it's going to do is try to read. If you can't read, then catch the exception. Okay. The reason why we need to do that instead of throwing the exception here is because this method is an overridden method that already exists. We cannot add or modify it in that way. Okay. So we're gonna try or cache. That's no problem. We're all good. After we have read the entries, right, we should be able to actually see them. So just so we can see them, because we're not gonna do the table part just yet, I'm just gonna print them, just a regular print. Yeah. So I'm just gonna do PFL dot PF list, which is an array list. I'm just gonna print it here. Okay, so we can see it, how we're actually reading from the file. So what is the read entries method doing? The read entries method doing, what I want to do, the logic that I want to do is that every time that I call read entries or every time that I open the window, I want to grab all of the entries that are on the file and I'm going to recreate the array list because I don't know what's going to be on the array list at this point, right? The array list only works in runtime. So if I already added entries this time that I run the application, maybe the array list has some values that I have added, right? But if I just open the application for the first time, maybe the array list doesn't have anything. So in order to make sure that my array list and my file are at all times equal, the first thing that I'm going to do is actually I'm going to clear up the array list. Whenever I'm going to read from the file, I'm actually going to take that list, that array list that I create, the PF list, and I'm going to clear it. I'm going to empty it first. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. That's so I don't duplicate values. There's maybe something in the array list, and since I'm going to read everything from the file that is already there, I don't want to overwrite, I don't want to duplicate. So I'm going to make sure that my list is clear, and I'm going to read everything again, okay? So there you go. I have a file reader, I have buffer reader, and now all I have to do is make sure that I read each one of those lines of text that I have on my file. So how do I do that? I'm just going to create a string to read each one of the lines. I'm going to call it line. Yeah. And I'm going to create a while statement. Okay. So look at what this while statement is going to do. I'm going to, and this is going to remind you of the beautiful collections, hopefully. I'm going to go and save what's on the first line, if there's something, okay? So I'm gonna go and read a line, yeah? And if what I just read is not null, remember, if it's not empty collection, then that means that there's still something on that file. That means that I just find something on that file, yeah? If it's null, then stop looping. Make sense? That's exactly what we do with collections. That's what this might make you maybe understand collections a little bit better. We're gonna read the file until no more lines on the file, okay? What am I gonna do with each one of those lines that I'm reading on my file? I'm going to create a new entry, right? Let's call it new PFE, okay? And I'm gonna use just the constructor that I created, and that one requires for me to actually create a new object, right? So I'm gonna have to create a new object, but I have a string. So let me see if I can explain this clearly. Remember that I have, what I'm fetching right now is this line, yeah? When I go and do read line from my file, remember BR is reading from that file, is going to go and fetch this first line until the /n. So it's going to take this line. So I have this that has the date, has the description, the money, and the category. And I need to create an object out of that. But I cannot create an object out of that because I need the date and all of this separated. I need to separate those commas, okay? So in order to separate those commas, what I'm going to do in order to make it a little bit more organized, let me just comment this line for a second here. Let's put this on hold. I'm going to go into my entry class, and the same way that I create a toString method, remember how I created a string to convert from each one of those values into one string to write on the file? I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm actually going to create a method that needs to be a static method, actually. Okay, I'm going to call it from string. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to do a method that is going to take a string and it's going to convert it into a personal finance entry. Yeah, so it's going to receive a string. I'm going to call it line from the files. Okay, and I'm going to convert it into a personal finance entry. Okay, so how am I going to do that? I'm going to take that string and I'm going to convert it into an array. Okay, so I'm going to take, there's a method for that. I'm going to take that string line. Oh, I cannot call it string line array. I'm going to call it this one. I'm going to take this string that I'm reading. That's this little line. Yeah. And I'm going to convert it into an array. So this is going to be on the first element of the array, second element of the array, third element of the array, fourth element of the array. There's a method for that to make our lives a little bit more easier. I'm just going to take that string and I'm going to split it using the comma. So every time that you find a comma, create a component of that array. That's what this method does. Okay. And now that I have that on an array, I can actually create an entry. I call it new PFE using the regular constructor. And the regular constructor requires for me to provide a date first, right? So remember that our date is the first thing over here. So I'm just gonna grab that from the line array at position 0. Yeah, makes sense? Then I'm gonna need a description. The description is the second one on that line. So I'm gonna do line array at position 1. Then I'm gonna need, I don't know, what do I need? What is my constructor? String description, I need a value, right? But I have a text. So remember that I'm gonna need to convert that text into, that will be line array at position 2. It's gonna be a text, I need to convert it into a double. And finally, the last thing that I need is the category, which is also a string. So not a problem, we're just gonna get that one in position 3. Yep, so I'm creating a new object from the class personal finance entry using the string that I'm reading by separating by commas and passing those as parameters for the constructor. And of course, I need to return that new PFE. That's an object, yeah? So I've created basically the opposite to the toString method here, okay? So going back into my list, now every time that I read a line, I can use that method that I just created to create a new object from a personal new finance entry. And if you remember static methods, they can be called like this. So I'm just gonna pass that line that I just read that is not null. Yeah, I know that because I'm inside of the while. Yeah, and that line is gonna be converted into an object. Yeah, now that that line is converted into an object, I'm just gonna go and add it into my array list. So I'm gonna take my array list that is called PF list, and I'm going to add the new PFE object that I created. Yep. So I'm gonna loop through the entire file. Every time I'm gonna grab each one of these lines, I'm gonna take this text and turn it into an array. Each one of those items of the array, I'm gonna use it to create an object from the PF entry. And then each one of those PF entries, I'm gonna add them to my array list. So after I finish running this method, I should have read each one of these lines, and basically I'm converting each one of these lines in objects and adding them to my list. That's it, yeah? So let's see. Remember that in the controller, now I'm calling that method and then I'm just printing the list. So the list should be updated at this point, should be reading everything that is on the file, yeah? Let's see if it's working. I'm gonna go to the application. I'm gonna run my application. So right now, even without doing anything whatsoever, as you can see, because the page just loaded, just because the page loaded, this method is being called. I'm reading the entries and I'm printing the list. Let's see, it's printing the list with the 3 items that I have in there listed separated by commas. So it's working. Let's see, so if I go and add an entry, let's add a new one with 130 in category housing, let's say. Add an entry, yeah. I'm gonna go back to see expenses, and because this page just loaded, it's printing, and now it just printed the new value that I just added. So it's working. It's reading from my file, it's updating my file, and it's reading from the file. So the part of reading, check. I'm being able to read from the file right now, okay? So I've learned 2 things. I've learned how to create a method that will run as soon as I load the file, and I have learned how to read from a file. Yeah, comparing this with a collection successfully. What am I missing? Now that I have this information on my array list, I want to show it as a table. Yeah, that part is a little bit tricky, but we can do it. So let's go to the controller to create that last part. So for that last part, we're going to need to make sure that we add a little bit of the FXML components that we're missing here, right? So we did create on the FXML, we created a table and we created some table columns. So let's add those to our FXML file. So what did we do? Let's open up again this FXML. Let's put it on a side so we can see them both. And let's remember that we created this table view and these table columns. They have an ID, right? So we're gonna need to recreate that here on the controller. So I'm gonna go and do the same that we did for this. I'm gonna say FXML, yeah? And I'm gonna create the table view. Yeah, I'm gonna say table view. I call it table view. It's going to ask me to import that class, of course. And I'm also going to do the table columns. So each one of the columns of my table. So table column. And the ones that I created were the table column for the date, the table column for the description, the table column for the value, and the table column for the category. Again, I don't need to initialize those because those are done automatically. Okay, that's what the FXML takes care of. Perfect, we have those. I don't need this anymore. I have all of my table view and all of that ready. And I'm trying to do that here on my initialize, yeah? So perfect, I have read the entries, I have the entries, now I just need to show them on that table. So how am I gonna do that? I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna need to create something that is called an observable array list. So an observable array list is another class that simply auto updates every time that we load something based on a list. Yeah, so we're gonna connect the array list, this array list, right, that we created with a new object that is an FXML object, I'm sorry, a JavaFX object that allows us to refresh the view every time that we load that table, okay? So we are going to take, we are going to create that object, and we're going to create it. Maybe let's create it outside over here. Let's create an observable list. So besides all of this, maybe here at the same level, let's create an observable array list. What it is? Observable array list. Where did it go? I don't think it's an observable array. Let me check. It's actually just called an observable list. Hey, what's it doing? There you go, observable list. And we're gonna make it same as our array list. So our array list is an array list of personal finance entries. So let's do that. Okay, and let's call it observable list. Yeah, just that. Okay, so we have this one. I'm gonna go back down to my initialize method. Now that I have my array list, I'm gonna take that OL and I'm gonna use this, the FX collections, to convert this into this list into an observable list. So I'm just gonna do dot observable array list, and I'm going to pass as a parameter that list. That should be updated because I just updated by reading on the file. Yeah. So I'm converting my array list into an observable list because I need that for my table. Okay. Now I'm gonna take each one of the values on my columns. So those are my table column description, for example. And we're gonna use a method that is going to simply kind of like link each one of the columns to each one of the attributes of my class personal finance entry, because I already said that this observable list is going to follow the structure of the personal finance entry. Yeah, so that's done by using this set value factory. And I'm gonna say this is just a standard. You're gonna have to just go with me on this one. There's property value factory here that we need to create. New property value factory. Yeah, and we're gonna say this is gonna be from type personal finance entry. Yeah, and the description is actually a string. Yep, and we call it on the personal finance entry, we call that description. Okay, there you go. So we're gonna need to repeat this for each one of the columns. So I'm gonna do the other table column with the category, and I'm gonna set the value factory to a new property value factory. It's gonna be of the same type, also a string. And this is actually misspelled here, description. And this one is gonna be the category. Yeah. Perfect, let's keep going. We also need to have the date. So the date is also a string. In my model for the personal finance entry, remember that that's a string. I'm gonna do a new property value factory. This is gonna be a personal finance entry and a string, and that string is gonna be the date. What did I do? No, this is in the wrong place. Okay, and last but not least, I'm gonna have to do also the column for my value. The column for my value, same story. It's a new property value factory, a personal finance entry, but this time remember that this is a double. Yeah, remember that the value is a double and not a string. Okay, There you go. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. And what we're gonna do is now that we have these 4 columns, we are actually going to add it to the table. So we're gonna take the table that we created, the table view object, and we're gonna set the items to that observable list that we created. That should be it, okay? Okay, so if I run it right now, it's gonna work, but it's gonna have an error. Let's see. If I run it, it should be reading from the file, all of the ones that we created before, and it should be putting on the table. So that part is working. It's putting on the table, that's all good. The problem right now is that if I click on add entry, it's going to throw me a lot of errors. Why is that? Remember that I said that this method initialize runs every time that we run a fxml, because we're using a controller, same controller for 2 fxmls. So when I run the controller for the first time, the application for the first time is running this fxml, there's a table view there, good, it works. But when I'm trying to open this one, it's telling me, hey, I can't find a table column on this add entry view. Doesn't exist, right? So it's gonna run into an error there. It's trying to run this method when in the screen that doesn't have a table view. So I need to now add another line of code because I need to make sure that this only happens, this method should only happen when I'm trying to load this fxml and not when I'm trying to load this one. There's again, many ways in which we could do that. I decided that I'm simply going to add an if statement here at the top. Yeah. Remember that this method initialize loads where am I located, where I'm coming from, the URL where I'm coming from. So I'm going to use that URL and I'm going to check to see. And the URL refers to basically where am I located, which fxml I am coming from. Okay. And I'm going to see if this one is equal to this fxml. Yeah. So if you remember correctly, we can get to that fxml by using the get class method and getting a resource. And we're gonna get that resource. Personal finance view dot fxml. And if we get that resource and it happens to be the same one that where we're at, then I need you to try and create that data table. Otherwise, don't, because there's not going to be a table there. So I don't even need an else. Simply the method initialize is going to do nothing if we are not on the personal finance screen. Let's see, gonna run again. Run the application. It's reading from the file and loading all of those here. When I add a new entry, soap. I don't know what I came with soap, but soap. That's I don't know. House. Add entry. And when it's gonna clear it up, and when I go back to see expenses, that has been updated here. So it's doing everything. It's reading from the file. You can look at the file. The file has been updated too with a new item. Yeah, I'm reading those and listing them here. I'm being able to move between screens. I'm being able to read and write from a file. And I'm also being able to actually create a table view. Okay, that's it. Now you are really, really, really done. We're good.